Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online Psych, Culture, and Society course, and I'm here to walk you through all the hottest topics in psychology. Today we're going to look at morality and religion, so without further ado, let's jump into it. In our themes for this chapter, morality is shaped by codes that vary across culture. Cultures may also differ on what domain qualifies as being under the purview of morality. There's a perception among many that as the world progresses, people will rely less on religious explanations of the world around us and turn more towards scientific explanation. The German philosopher Nietzsche famously claimed God is dead. Secularization theory, religion is on the decline, and people everywhere are discovering new secular and rational ways to make sense of the world. Trend is culturally constrained, however, with religions rising in some regions of the world. This and other forms of cultural differences have shaped the moral systems in different places around the world. Kohlberg's stage theory of morality is the most influential model of moral reasoning. There's an immense amount of research for and against it. Proposes that moral reasoning progresses along three stages of levels: pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional levels, and progression is assumed to be sequential and universal. So this is obviously the theory of morality that everyone is taught in their gen psych courses and primarily relied upon in developmental psychology courses. So we're going to briefly review them, but then discuss the cross-cultural evidence supporting and challenging this theory, and as well as alternative theories to moral development, because shockingly, there is not only one theory of moral development, despite their exclusion from the majority of psych courses. Kohlberg believed the main influences on moral development are cognitive growth and social interactions with peers. Individuals need Piaget's formal operational thinking. Adolescents can think about abstract concepts and purely hypothetical possibilities. The moral growth is facilitated by discussions about moral issues, advanced schooling, going to college, participating in complex democratic society where people weigh various opinions and appreciate that laws reflect a consensus of citizens. So kind of as I said before, Kohlberg was a stage theorist, and kind of as a reminder of that, that's why I kind of have the image of a stairs, because it's one easy way to conceptualize it, where in each kind of stair step you kind of unlock new abilities that were unavailable to you in previous stages. And people are thought to universally advance through those stages with age and alongside, well, which accompanies certain advances in cognitive abilities. So you can see the influence of Piaget here, who's also a stage theorist. And in the case of Piaget, kind of where Kohlberg ties it in is that once you hit X stage, in this case, formal operational thinking, where you're able to weigh hypotheticals, then an individual is capable of abstract reasoning, which allows for kind of playing with these ideas of morality and developing higher levels of morality within that stage model. And as stated, moral growth kind of facilitated by these going to college, advanced schooling, and participating in democratic societies. And obviously, you can immediately see that some of the potential weird biases built within this theory. So, for example, going to college and really kind of graduating from college, we know that the majority of Americans do not do so, and really the majority of the world. So basically, that's kind of implying that people around the world, the supermajority of people, are unable to kind of reason morally. And even other things, kind of like democratic society. What does democratic society mean? Kohlberg had a specific understanding of it, but is that kind of like this participatory representative system of political representation within the United States? Is that more of a parliamentary system? Does that encompass just basic liberties or the protection of freedom of speech or particular liberties? Or does it also include economic rights or other types of rights, or which are encompassed in different types of democratic societies, because there are different versions or different visions of what that actually means across the country, or across the world, I should say, and obviously within the country as well. And the classic example is the Heinz dilemma. In testing to determine at which stage people are in within the Kohlberg stage theory of morality, They are confronted. Participants are confronted with moral dilemmas, and their decisions in those dilemmas reflect the stage that they are in within the Kohlberg model. The quote Heinz dilemma is a famous moral dilemma that can be used to compare different responses and categorize responses by ages or stages. So this is the classic example. I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but basically the idea here is that there is a husband and wife, and it kind of varies slightly, but kind of the general idea is that there's a husband and wife, and the wife or husband has a chronic condition, and we'll just say the wife has a chronic condition because it's written here, and the drug price is, incredibly expensive, even though it's basically marked, times 10. The price is 10 times higher than it costs to make. Thus, kind of like there's making exuberant profits off this drug, and so whatever the husband cannot afford to pay for it, and therefore the question then is, what should the husband do, given the fact that the hospital or the drug manufacturer is charging outrageous prices, and they won't reduce the price or allow this individual to just pay back the balance of whatever the cost of the price over a series of installment payments over a long period of time. And then you ask, so then the final takeaway is that the person breaks into the store, the husband that is, breaks into the drugstore, steals the drugs for his wife. And then you just ask the participant, should Heinz, who is the husband in this story, should he have done that? Why or why not? And based on those responses, an individual is kind of said to be at one of the three stages. Now let's quickly review those stages. For each stage, there are different considerations for what is considered moral. Pre-conventional level, rules are external to the self rather than internalized. Conventional level, morality involves trying to maintain or facilitate social order by following rules and not questioning where the rules came from. The individual has internalized many moral values. And post-conventional, morality involves considering abstract, universal ethical principles that emphasize justice and individual rights by logically extending those principles. So, kind of some quick examples. Pre-conventional level, rules are external to yourself. That's basically like, I'll get punished if I don't follow these rules, or I'll get praise from my parents if I follow these rules. So the rules are external to the self, and they are not internalized, versus conventional, where the rules are now become more internalized, I should say. And the idea here is that you don't question where the rules came from, and your support for or against it, is kind of, if you would be for a certain behavior and operating at a conventional level, you would say something like, this is maintaining social order. If we don't follow the rules, then you're kind of like breaking the law. And the law is important because, well, it's the law. Versus post-conventional level, and this is these universal ethical principles. So something like, I have this universal abstract kind of conception of morality that exists beyond the law, that should be applied across all circumstances, and sometimes the laws can be wrong, and therefore you have to operate on these higher level universal ethical principles of justice. And that's why you would do something, versus why you should not do something. You could say the argument would be something like violating this, or doing, you should not take this action, because if you don't, everybody, that'll set an example for everyone, wherein now everybody's kind of acting on their own morals outside of the rule of law, and all of a sudden basically society has collapsed because everybody's acting independently and unable to cooperate and preserve society as it exists. And for responses for the Heinz question, pre-conventional level for it, he can get away with it, so kind of an absence of punishment, versus he should not steal the drug because he might get caught. So kind of you get punished. The rules, these are external to you. Conventional, He should not steal the drug because it's against the law. Again, kind of this internalization of the law. He should steal the drug because others will look down on him if he lets his wife die. So in this case, it's kind of a following social rules or kind of an internalization of norms within a society. So in this case, the norms and responsibilities of a husband not letting his wife die without doing anything, kind of more of like an honor thing. Post-conventional morality, so as stated, you should steal the drug because the protection of human life is a higher moral principles that can overrule laws against stealing. So again, kind of this idea that there is a higher morality than an individual law. Just because it's a law does not mean you should never break it. Hyde should not steal the drug because doing so violates a basic social contract needed to preserve civilization. Thou shalt not steal. So you can see kind of a secular reason and or a religious reason, wherein the individual should not steal because of a universal set of moral principles. And there are other obviously responses to this, but kind of this is a general idea of how you place somebody within Kohlberg's level, given the responses to the Heinz dilemma. A meta-analysis revealed that among 27 cultures, in all cultural groups there were adults at level 2. In no groups was the average adult at level 1. Children were generally at level 1, and every urban Western sample had at least some adults at level 3. No tribal society had any adults at level 3. Now it's important to note that even Kohlberg, I believe within the United States, said the supermajority of people would never reach level 3 level morality. But from this meta-analysis, you can see that no tribal societies had any adult at level 3 morality. So then that begs the question, are these tribal societies incapable of achieving, I guess, the highest levels of morality? Not so, according to kind of using the Kohlberg scale. And thus, it begs the question, what is the kind of weird bias embedded within this model? And are there other possible other alternative models that might measure morality in different ways? There are two competing interpretations that have been discussed to explain the cultural differences seen in research on Kohlberg's model. The first explanation is that the education in the West allows people to reach the third level. However, there is a risk of ethnocentric bias. That is, this interpretation presupposes that the third stage is the best. The second interpretation is much more relativistic, such that cultures are seen as encountering different challenges, and so the moral systems that they develop are in response to particular cultural environments. There may be moral values that Kohlberg's model does not include. So this is almost like, it's a little different, but kind of similar to kind of when we talked about Big Five theory of personality, where there are different components of personality found in different cultures, given and kind of in response to their environmental circumstances, be them social, economic, geographic, political, economic, etc. And thus, in this case, morality, there will be different dimensions of morality across the world, and the Kohlberg model may be measuring a specific type of morality or morality found, within the United States. But even Kohlberg admitted that and argued that most people do not ever hit level 3. Just theoretically within the United States, there may be other dimensions of morality found across the world, and for that matter, going back to the first explanation, maybe educational systems in the West are less likely to achieve those dimensions of morality, but other dimensions of morality, such as the morality stages, and or I should say the moral reasoning found within each of the stages of Kohlberg's model. As a critique of Kohlberg's model, Schroeder argues that it represents only one of 3 different ethics. Schroeder proposes 3 key moral ethics that are evident universally: the ethic of autonomy, the ethic of community, and the ethic of divinity. The West focuses on the ethic of autonomy, while much of the rest of the world focuses on the ethic of community and the ethic of divinity. And this will be consistent with kind of what we talked about throughout this course: the higher levels of individuality, independent sense of self, and kind of the quest to uphold personal personal decisions and kind of liberty found within the West. And Schroeder argued that other cultures value ethics more strongly. So it's kind of like these three components of ethics exist across the world, but cultures differ in the degree to which they emphasize and support and value the varying ethics across these ethical components across the world. So Kohlberg kind of focuses on his version is not necessarily wrong, but really it's kind of within that category of ethic of autonomy. And there are these other ethics that exist, community and divinity, that is not represented within Kohlberg's model. Now let's walk through each of these components of ethics. The ethic of autonomy focuses on individual freedom and rights, especially choice and individual liberty. A breach of morality involves someone who was harmed, denied his or her rights, acted unfairly, or tried to dominate someone else. Schroeder argues that Kohlberg's model, which emphasizes justice and individual rights, really taps into the ethic of autonomy. The highest level of moral reasoning upholds justice and individual rights. The West tends to focus on the ethic of autonomy. So kind of as I said in the previous slide, the idea here is, as stated, that ultimately individuals are trying to kind of pursue their own interests while kind of being unhindered by interpersonal relationships, but also kind of this idea of taking a non-harmful approach, where we're both kind of acting as individual actors within a social and economic marketplace, pursuing our own goals, but without, but kind of rules within that marketplace or social and economic, not acting, or the rules within them, those social and economic marketplaces kind of centered around not quote unquote harming it under another individual. So I'm able to act completely in full autonomy, unhindered by other people, while upholding individual rights to do so, and kind of justice centered around those rights of liberty, individual liberty and choice. The ethic of community. While the West focuses on the ethic of autonomy, much of the world focuses on the ethic of community and the ethic of divinity. The ethic of community involves conforming to the roles and duties of the community or social hierarchy. A breach of morality involves someone who showed a lack of loyalty, betrayed his or her group, or failed to fulfill the duties of his or her role. And you can quickly see that this would be representative in, as stated, much of the world, or most of the world, I should say, who places higher values on kind of these collective notions and interpersonal relationships. Thus, the fulfilling those interpersonal relationships and acting collectively is going to hold a place of morality within that culture. And kind of betraying someone or being loyal to someone is going to have lead to particular social outcomes in that culture because of various things, but also because they're viewed through a moral lens, wherein being loyal to those people within your in-group is seen as moral, and again, betrayal for failure to fulfill your duties and responsibilities within your community being seen as immoral. And you can even think back to kind of, again, our discussion on interdependent selves, wherein the self is tied to the role that you take within society, and kind of you have a responsibility to uphold those roles, and not just a responsibility, but as you can see here, kind of a moral responsibility to do so. How are people's social obligations different from, quote, moral versus, quote, immoral obligations? There's cultural variation in ethics can be studied by looking at whether people consider something to be a moral obligation. First, objective obligations, things people should do even if no official rule exists. Two, legitimately regulated, things people should be prevented from doing and for which they should be punished if they do them. If there is not a moral obligation, then it is a convention or a personal choice, a social obligation. So kind of just the idea here, the extent that you should do something even if no official rule exists or prevented from doing so, kind of represents a moral obligation, wherein that you should not violate it. First, it's kind of more of a social convention, a social obligation that It's more of a choice and, as stated, like a convention. That is, you kind of have like a rule maybe in the classroom, like don't leave the classroom without permission, for example. But obviously, if the classroom's on fire, you should leave. So it's kind of convention, kind of just to make things run properly, but still it's a matter of personal choice involved and kind of just something you do within the function of that given immediate environment. Whereas these moral obligations are something that you should do kind of no matter what, or should not do kind of no matter what. A study of moral dilemmas that pitted justice, that is autonomy, violations, against interpersonal, that is community violations, between Americans and Indians. Researchers found that regardless of the severity of the violations, Indians consistently chose to uphold interpersonal obligations more than Americans did. This suggests that Indians are more likely to consider interpersonal obligations as moral obligations. However, even within one country, there can be much variability in moral reasoning. Within each country, while there's a general pattern towards certain ways of thinking, there are also many people who would arrive at different solutions to the same moral dilemma. So basically, we have a study here wherein we present individuals have to choose between committing a autonomy violation, a justice violation, that is kind of the ethics of autonomy, and versus violating an interpersonal or ethic of community violation. So you have to choose one or the other, basically. And in this study, no matter the severity of the autonomy violation, when you're in kind of that forced choice scenario, Indians are more likely to consider interpersonal. Are likely to uphold, I should say, interpersonal obligations. So choosing the action that upholds interpersonal obligation, which is suggestive of that they consider interpersonal obligations, those community ethics, as moral obligations. Again, that should be found, that you should do basically no matter what. So it's kind of like that's the universal ethic that trumps theoretically these other ethical components. However, as stated, there's always cultural variability within each culture, and kind of what we talked about, I believe, in discussion 2 or 3. But kind of the idea that these are kind of group averages, but however, within any group, there is variability and obviously various subgroups within any country. The ethic of divinity. The ethic of divinity has to do with the sanctity of things and involves the preservation of the natural order of things as established by some transcendental or authority. Often involves a belief that God has created a sacred world which one must respect and preserve. One is obligated to preserve the standards mandated by a transcendent authority. A breach of morality involves causing impurity or degradation, showing disrespect for God or the gods or God's creations. Some studies suggested that people who have a lower class status tend to base their moral judgments more on the ethic of divinity than people who have a higher class status, who abide more by the ethic of autonomy. So this one is relatively straightforward. There is some divinity that has laid down a set of rules that are moral and that you should follow across environments or circumstances. And those laws or rules kind of trump other components of morality. However, even in countries with high levels of ethics of divinity, individuals who are higher class status tend to value and abide more by the ethic of autonomy. And this could kind of make sense for straightforward reasons. You have money and you want to act and pursue your financial interests and kind of act in your own individual interests, given your class status, even within a country that may place higher value on the ethic of divinity than other countries, relatively higher value ethic of divinity values than other cultures. Some people have suggested that in the United States, even different groups of the same religion may differ in their moral reasoning. Depends on whether the group is orthodox or progressive. For people who are orthodox, there's a knowledgeable and powerful transcendental authority who has existed since time immemorial. Authority created a moral code that should not change, regardless of time or societal changes. Progressives believe that while a transcendental authority exists, humans play an integral role in the formation of moral codes, and that moral codes must change to adapt to changing societal circumstances. So kind of, as stated before, kind of reviewing briefly the orthodox religious notions of morality, wherein there's some divinity that existed from beginning of time. Moral code was created, and regardless of circumstances or time, that moral code should be followed. Versus more of a progressive religious view, wherein kind of the cultures and or historical eras impact these moral codes, and these moral codes are adapted and shifted depending on the circumstances within a country and historical period. Looking at empirical evidence for this distinction, these two general religious groups also demonstrate reliable differences in the forms of ethic that they abide by when engaging in moral judgments. For example, when asked to justify their responses to a variety of political questions, progressive Baptists gave more autonomy-based and community-based justifications than did Orthodox Baptists. The reverse was true for divinity-based justifications. So you can see that even within religions, there are various subgroups that rely on different or prioritize different components of the ethics, with progressive Baptists in this study justifying their actions using autonomy-based, but community-based decision making as more moral than Orthodox Baptists did. And Orthodox Baptists reported higher levels of divinity-based justifications for their decisions. Jonathan Haidt has expanded Schroeder's three ethics into five moral foundations. The ethic of autonomy consists of 1. Avoiding harm, and 2. Protecting fairness. The ethics of community consists of 3. Loyalty to in-groups, and 4. A respect for hierarchy. And the ethic of divinity consists of achieving purity. So kind of, again, another model, again, being much more expansive, which typically happens for all these models. There are dozens of models, and obviously some are more predominant than others, in that case Colbert, but there are other models that exist, and other scholars with different models. And in this case, we're kind of expanding on Schroeder's model, and then kind of by giving each of the components kind of subcategories, wherein individuals can vary within the endorsement, or I should say they vary within their levels of endorsement of those subcomponents of the ethics of the three ethical components. So we have the three components, and then we have varying subcomponents. Moral intuition and political views. The extent to which one adheres to these different foundations is associated with political affiliation. A study forced people to put a monetary value on how much it would take them to engage in certain forms of violations. People who consider themselves to be very liberal tend to have stronger inclinations toward the ethic of autonomy by feeling more strongly about avoiding harm and protecting fairness, demonstrated by statements that it would require a lot of money for them to be willing to engage in certain violations. People who identify themselves as very conservative generally feel pretty strongly about all five moral foundations, although they tend to have stronger feelings toward ethics of divinity, purity, than do people who are very liberal. So basically the idea here is that if you're a very conservative person, you're more likely to feel strongly about all five of those moral foundations. So in regards to this particular study, the idea here is that I'm asking you how much money it would take for you to violate one of those five components of morality, or moral foundations. And very conservative individuals are likely to endorse very high levels of monetary value, or high levels of money it would take for them to violate any of those five moral foundations. So they're better worded. It takes a lot of money for them to violate any of the five moral foundations, versus very liberal people who have stronger inclinations toward the ethic of autonomy. That is violating those subcomponents of fairness and harm within the third component of ethic of autonomy. It would take higher levels of money for them to violate those ethics relative to the other ethics, ethics of community and divinity, or in that case, breaking it up into subcategories, it would take them higher amounts of money to violate principles of the ethic of autonomy, which consists of avoiding harm and protecting fairness, relative to the ethics of community and divinity, which exists of loyalty to groups and respect for hierarchy and achieving purity. So it costs them much more money, these very liberal participants, to violate ethics of autonomy, but less money to violate ethics of community and achieving purity. I should also kind of add even kind of the weird notion within this study, because there are other political dimensions that exist besides liberal and conservative. I think in the United States, surveys are typically categorized as varying degrees of liberalism versus conservatives, but other political affiliations, I think, would take kind of offense to, and it kind of like leaves them out. So for example, like socialists or some kind of Marxist communist or something like that would kind of not endorse themselves as very liberal. So it's kind of difficult at times to collect data on those individuals. Again, kind of reflecting this American ideas of the political spectrum. But regardless, kind of this is the general findings, and this is the how this study in particular is set up. And basically what you see here is kind of what I was saying before, and that if you look into the very right, you see all the lines very kind of close to each other, and what we have on the y-axis is how much money it would take for an individual to violate that particular moral principle, with each of the 5 lines representing one of the 5 foundations of morality. And on the right side, you can see all 5 of the lines being relatively close together. Obviously, the y-axis is doing a little work for us. They look kind of very close. Where, like, for example, that's, these not a great axis or axes, kind of absurd, frankly, which is like times 10 for each one of them. So it looks far more close than it actually is. But kind of just speaking in relative terms, you can see the left side of the graph here much more fanned out than the right side of the graph. And the left side of the graph, on the x-axis, representing very liberal, and the right side of the graph representing very conservative, with a very warped, kind of poor representation of the y-axis. But I mean, it's kind of a limitation of these kind of graphs trying to fit on a single piece of paper. But regardless, we see in the very left the notions of autonomy, violations of the ethics of autonomy, requiring more money to convince a very liberal person to violate, versus an ethic of authority being a much lower level, being under $1,000, for example, which provides evidence of different political affiliations endorsing or valuing different foundations of morality at different levels. Religion and achievement motivation. Weber's The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism argued that capitalism was tied to cultural ideas that came from the Protestant Reformation, including individual relation with God, call, which is defined as a unique God-given purpose, and predestination, defined as before a person was born, it was already determined whether he or she was going to heaven or hell. According to Weber, these ideas made it a moral duty to work to gain achievements. And we talked about this in previous chapters, and we're going to expand on this momentarily, but kind of what you want to begin to kind of frame this a discussion in the idea that these religious systems are tied to and are influenced by larger political, or I should say other structures such as political and economic structures. And basically Weber's arguing that these Protestant ethics kind of reflected and reinforced kind of notions of capital logic as capitalism began to form, alongside kind of the Protestant Reformation kind of occurring. A little earlier, but kind of reflecting and reinforcing kind of global trends of the historical period, of that 1500s to 1700s, a historical period, where we're seeing the Protestant Revolution, we're seeing this Enlightenment period, we're seeing the emergence of capitalism, kind of all reinforcing each other. Now let's jump into more specifics. These ideas fueled the Protestant work ethic. That is, people needed to find their calling and devote their lives to it. No one knew if they were among the, quote, elect, those predetermined to go to heaven. The only clue, or one clue, was that God would only reward the elect. Since it was sinful to enjoy the fruits of one's labor, one should reinvest to further pursue their calling. This idea became secularized and woven into the cultural fabric, leading everyone to accumulate wealth. The accumulations of capital and culture laid the foundations of capitalism. So kind of the idea here is we have this idea of predestination, and therefore nothing really you can do can really impact if you're among the elect, that is, those predetermined to go to heaven or hell. However, you are a human and you exist within this world, and you're trying to figure out, okay, how the hell can I figure out if I'm going to heaven or not? So one way that people did this was looking around to say, okay, who was being rewarded, and how could you judge rewarding? Kind of your class status, your relative material wealth compared to other individuals. This, alongside the idea that people need to find their calling, that is, their unique God-given purpose, which requires them working towards kind of that purpose at all times, and again, that purpose being tied to as a human and existing in this world, trying to figure out, insecure about the kind of death, that purpose tied to, or the fulfillment of your purpose and kind of the material wealth gained around you is kind of evidence of your being among the elect. So thus you are going to work very hard to fulfill your calling, your purpose, by working extremely hard and just tirelessly, but also kind of judge other people and kind of view them as sinful, those individuals who kind of are below you within kind of a social class or having less material wealth than you, because that's kind of a visual example, a little hint that that person is not among the elect. Over time, these kind of ideas become more secularized, and as capitalism begins to emerge and develop, more fully develop and emerge, I should say, alongside kind of other Enlightenment ideas, this is becoming more secularized. But however, these kind of cultural practices, that secularization kind of still contributes to this idea that you should still kind of work hard no matter what, and this working hard and accumulating wealth is still seen as kind of this moral thing, even though it's not necessarily on religious terms, but now more kind of this secular work ethic, wherein the accumulation of wealth still demonstrates your relative material advantage over others, still demonstrates your superiority among your secular version of the elect. So again, kind of this idea of the accumulation of capital representing your morality, whether that be secular or religious. And kind of that work ethic contributes to, it is reinforced by merchant capitalism, and this work ethic creates kind of this accumulation of capital, and kind of the idea here is the cultural framework and the capital, that is the wealth required for the foundations of capitalism. Historical evidence. In 19th century Germany, Protestant counties were wealthier and had greater literacy than Catholic counties. A survey of per capita income in countries worldwide found that Protestant nations earn more income than mixed Protestant Catholic nations, which in turn earn more than Catholic nations. The Protestant parents expected their children to become self-reliant earlier than Catholic parents, and stories written by Protestant boys had more evidence of strong achievement motivations than stories written by Catholic boys. So kind of the idea here is that these historical markers are reflective of that Protestant work ethic. And while Catholics having different kind of religious views, wherein they are far lower levels of kind of predestination views of religion, thus that kind of notion of needing to find that call and needing to find who the elect were, kind of not existing at the same levels in these Catholic counties or mixed Catholic Protestant counties. Thus, kind of lower levels of capital accumulation because their morals are less affected by both secular and kind of divinity ethics are less affected by that notion of Protestant work ethic. And now some more contemporary empirical evidence. A study found that Americans, but not Canadians, who were primed for salvation-related concepts exhibited a stronger work ethic afterwards, suggests that the Protestant work ethic has been secularized into the general American cultural fabric. A study found that American-born office workers were more likely to decorate their own cubicles in a professional manner with fewer personal items than immigrants to the United States. Americans considering a hypothetical job candidate reacted more negatively than Indians did when the candidate mentioned non-work-related roles and activities. The Americans preferred candidates who only discussed information directly relevant to the job. American Protestants were less likely than American non-Protestants to pay attention to other people's relational cues during work. When Protestants are working, they seem less interested in anything else. So kind of beginning with the first study outline. So priming, kind of the idea is you show a very quick image or set of terms that are related to salvation-related concepts. Americans are, following that priming, Americans relative to Canadians show a much stronger work ethic afterwards. And this is kind of reflects that obviously the country is not all Protestant. However, this secularization of this Protestant work ethic being widespread within American culture. And you can just see over time that the economic circumstances, these political circumstances, impact these, and I should say are reflected by and influence, they kind of bidirectionally influence or multi-directional influence each other, wherein even individuals who are not religious or maybe a different religion are still impacted by these religious practice, namely the Protestant work ethic. And you can see this in other studies as well, with American individuals being less likely to decorate their cubicles, their work areas with personal items, because that's a place of work. You're not really supposed to focus on playtime. This is work time, and it's very focused, and it's something that you should be wholly dedicated to, not take time off, not be distracted. It's kind of the serious, almost secular or religious, but kind of this broader moral compass that this work ethic represents. And therefore, and when individuals talk about themselves in the office setting or within an application, Americans are kind of more likely to kind of look down upon or kind of react more negatively to individuals who kind of distract from their work goals. So that is Weber's thesis, kind of just religion, economics and politics, kind of where economics, as I stated, economics, politics, and religious impacting each other and shifting through time into different secular versions and even kind of American versions of this Protestant work ethic. And but over time, and across like hundreds of years, kind of laying kind of a lot of the norms, or contributing to, I should say, a lot of the work habit norms and kind of notions of morality found within the United States. Morality of thoughts. There seems to be a divide between Judaism and Christianity in terms of whether thoughts constitute a moral domain. Judaism, primarily based on the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, as well as the Talmud. In these texts, what are most important are for morality are behaviors. The Old Testament, i.e. the Hebrew Bible, has little to say about beliefs and focuses mostly on behaviors. For example, 8 of the 10 commandments concern behaviors. Judaism places greater emphasis on important practices such as keeping kosher, and one is Jewish by birth. Thoughts are not within the realm of morality, instead behavior is most important. Christian sects differ. They draw on the New Testament, and in this text, thoughts are also become subject to moral judgments. The New Testament, i.e. the Christian part of the Bible, explicitly discusses private thoughts as moral domains. Christian sects are also focused more on faith and belief. One must accept the beliefs of the religion to be Christian. Thoughts are also important for morality. One important distinction between the two religions is that Christian sects, particularly Protestants, feel their thoughts or feel that people have control over their thoughts, while Judaism assumes that people cannot control their thoughts. This makes sense when you consider the morality of thoughts, because if Jews feel that thoughts cannot be controlled, then it is harder to moralize thoughts. Jews feel that thoughts don't necessarily lead to behavior, while Protestants have a strong belief that thoughts do indeed lead to behavior. So kind of the idea here, the different religions having different views on the morality of thoughts, and this is kind of reflected in their text. But also as stated, there's a lot of variability even within those broad religions, Judaism and Christian, with different sects subscribing more to importance on the morality of thoughts, and again, as reflected in kind of their ideas of how much people can control their thoughts and the likelihood of thoughts contributing to behavior and certain outcomes. And kind of just a sub point that's really not tested on. Interestingly, some scholars, this is kind of the Barbara Einreich thesis, that kind of this a new age thought, and kind of the thoughts that if you control your mind, then behaviors are gonna will follow. So kind of controlling your thoughts, impacting your behavior is kind of reflected. That's kind of a continuation of kind of these idea of those Protestant work ethics, but also kind of this Protestant idea that, or American Protestant idea, wherein people have control over their thoughts, and those thoughts are likely to lead to behavior. There is cultural variation in the role of intention in judging the morality of harmful behavior. Traditional small-scale societies may think differently about intention than weird societies. For example, Yasawans from Fiji believe that trying to speculate about others' intentions for behavior is frowned on, viewed unintentional bad actions as almost as immoral as intentional ones. So kind of just cultural variation in the extent to which intention matters. That is, do you do something and accidentally or unintentionally cause harm to somebody in some way? Does that matter on a moral level? And that varies across cultures. So to wrap it up, morality can be based on different foundations across cultures, leading to disagreements both between and within cultures. Views on morality can vary by class, political economy, political attitudes, or religious denomination. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.